Hey all, we're back. So today, or in this segment, we're going to talk about really coal politics, I guess. Again, kind of reminding ourselves that one aspect of this class is the global perspectives designation. So, we could tromp along and learn all of the technical geological side of things and the ecological side of things and kind of forget about the political aspect, but it's important especially to kind of, like I said, have that global perspective and think about these resources in that sense. So it begs these two questions, and actually we've seen these questions before, right? We saw them in the case of oil. So who has the coal? Who wants the coal? And you could also add, how much coal do they want? Do they want as much coal as they used to want? So we're going to look at lots of charts and graphs in this segment. So here, this is actually a really good place to start. So initially, we're going to start focusing on the United States and our kind of internal coal industry. So this is a map that shows coal resources within the U.S. And they're keyed to different colors. So green, fluorescent green, that's anthracite coal. Red is low volatile bituminous coal, so kind of the higher percentage carbon bituminous coal. And then yellow, we've got medium high, and then blue sub-bituminous, and orange as lignite, but actually leaves peat off. That's not really a resource we use. So the first thing that I'd point out when we look here is there's really kind of three primary areas, and we'll revisit these in just a second. Over here in on the right-hand side, along the Appalachian Basin, and then in kind of the central eastern portion of the U.S., like the Kentucky area, and then over out west, particularly Wyoming. And we're going to talk about Wyoming a lot. That's where the vast majority of our coal is extracted. We've already mentioned that a couple of times. Okay, so let's look at the next map. This diagram is, again, it's a map. It's a little similar to the last one, although it doesn't differentiate by type, but it shows kind of these three major coal-producing regions in the U.S. and the percent of U.S. And you can see over on the East Coast, we've got the Appalachian Basin. Then we have the interior, which is at about 19%. Excuse me, the Appalachian is 25% of our national coal. And then you can see in the western portion, which really is kind of code word for Wyoming. There is a little bit that's done in Montana, but not as much. Montana doesn't even make the top 5 when we look at coal-producing states. So about 57% with the asterisk, including Alaska, of our coal comes from out west. But again, most of that is from Wyoming. So if we take another look at states just ranked by coal producing, should be no surprises here. We see, again, number 1 is Wyoming. Most coal that we produce comes out of Wyoming. And then West Virginia, number 2, I think, let me double check my notes here, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Kentucky finishing out the top 5. So we definitely produce a significant amount of coal in the U.S., but it's not evenly distributed, right? So some, just like we've seen in the past, there is this kind of aspect of geological roll of the dice, where some states are coal states and other states are not. Wyoming won that battle. Eventually we can zoom out and take a broader view, at least in the sense of production, right? So we looked at where coal is produced within the U.S., but it's important to not forget that we're part of a global community, right? We could kind of rally and talk about what sort of coal industry we have within our own country, but that's in some ways irrelevant when you start to look at what we see in the bigger picture. So this diagram shows us coal-producing regions, right? And what should pop to you right off the bat is most coal, globally, most coal is produced in China. They happen to have the geology that's conducive to that, right? So we can do a lot of coal, or they do a lot of coal extraction there. And as you can see on this diagram, the diameter of these circles is related to the amount of coal produced. And actually, if we look at the U.S., although we're not kind of comparing to China, but we do produce a significant amount of coal when we kind of at least compare ourselves on the global market. A lot of our coal, we don't necessarily use all of the coal that we produce, so we produce some amount, we use that to make power, but actually one of the things that we're going to be noticing is that those numbers have changed. And so as we use less coal, we have more coal that just ends up on the open market, very literally taken by train to a barge, loaded up on barges and put out in the ocean and taken to whoever's buying, right? Again, there are a lot of countries who don't necessarily have coal resources but yet still use coal for power, right? We saw something parallel to that with Japan and oil, right? So they don't have any oil reserves, but they use a lot. Aside from production, right? We just looked at production within the U.S. We looked at production on the global scale, and we saw, China is leading the production. The next question naturally to ask is, who's buying, right? So we've got all this coal out on the market, and who's using the coal, and how is that use changing? So you can see this is a map of the world, and again, it breaks things down into regions similar to what we've seen. But notice, for each region, there's two circles. So we're going to look at the lighter pink circle. That's the year 2000. And this is coal consumption by region. So a little bit different than we've been talking about. So if we look particularly at the U.S., we notice that we were using quite a bit of coal in the year 2000, shown by a fairly large circle. And that's reduced quite a bit. So now in 2015, I was going to say, I'm just double checking my references here. So this is from the IEA 2016 report. We're using a much smaller overall percentage of coal, and we're actually going to look at that in a couple of other ways. So the big reasons why are coal's more expensive, right? Coal is not a cheap power source, or at least it used to be the cheapest. Now we've got some technology where we can access natural gas relatively easily, and large volumes of that natural gas. It burns more cleanly, and it's easy to move around, or you can stick it in a pipeline. So let's take another look at this map with all the purple dots on it. So that trend that we saw in North America, right? This massive reduction, right? In 15 years, from using a significant amount to a much smaller percentage. We see that almost everywhere, right? So Europe used to be using 22% of the world's coal. Now it's using 12% of the world's coal. Not much change down in South America. Africa used to be using 4% of the world's coal. Now it's using 3%. Australia, similar. China is the anomaly here, right? So in those 15 years, China's use of coal has skyrocketed. So the one thing I wanted to talk about before we dive into really why that's the case is looking at North America, looking at Africa, looking at South America, looking at Australia and Europe. Those are places that have all seen essentially, growing population, in some cases maybe closer to flatline, but Africa in particular, growing population, so more people, but less coal used. So that starts to hopefully be intriguing. And then again, when we go back and look at China, we see this dramatic increase. Well, China really functions as the factory of the world, right? And so as we as consumers demand more things, in large part, China's producing those things. So the amount of power consumed by China is astronomical when compared with other countries. So first of all, remember 1.4 billion people, huge amount of, huge population. But many of those individual towns are manufacturing centers, and they may have a few different coal power plants among others. So they're not just using coal, but many of them are using coal to kind of patch in and quickly solve their power supply problems, because people want more factories and want more stuff, and they have to keep the power demand kind of high to match that. And so again, we see they kind of buck the trend here, now using 73% of the world's coal. Charts and graphs, right? I really think of these segments at the end of each different resource type as just the kind of charts and graphs one. So I know some people, I actually love charts and graphs. I could look at them all day. But the next kind of topic that we're going to get to really ties back to the last map that we were looking at, which showed, again, these different kind of shades of purple, how our usage, how our consumption has changed from 2000 to 2015. Again, so this is a graph you can see of coal, of U.S. coal consumption. It's from the EIA. You see that little logo actually on the top of a lot of these graphs that I'm showing. And that's the Energy Information Administration. So that's like a subgroup of the federal government. And so anyways, when we look at this, we see two lines, a blue line and a red line. Only one of those is actually directly related to electric power. So notice that the red line, that's coal consumption that we used in our coal-fired power plants. And the blue line is that plus other uses of coal. So there is a type of coal, I kind of actually left this out because we don't need to get too complicated, but metallurgical coal, so coal used in the production of metal, particularly in blast furnaces and things like that. So we have other uses for coal, and you can see the difference between the blue and the red lines. But either way, let's just kind of think about the arc of the blue line, right? So our total coal usage. And notice this is in millions of short tons per year. We top out at around, I don't know, 2008, 2009, and really we've significantly changed our usage of coal. And even if you look at the few years prior to that, it's starting to plateau. And so at that time we're using about 1,100 short tons of coal per year, and both of those have dropped fairly significantly down to around 70%. So really from 2008 to 2018, we've cut our national coal usage by about 30%. And you know, something that we'll see highlighted in some of the diagrams going forward is that that's not that we're using 30% less energy, it's that we've basically displaced that use and get that energy from a different source now, rather than relying on coal like we had. So coal consumption trends are a really interesting thing to look at. So at this point we've seen two things. We have the diagram with the purple dots where we saw kind of us using less coal as a power source. So the previous graph, and now again we can kind of back off and look at what we see at the global level. So this is kind of the line graph version of the purple dot diagram. And you can see here, this is global coal consumption. And if you look, India, US, at the bottom, kind of in the green and the orange lines. And then if we look at China, notice that China is ripping along. So in about the year 2000, 2001, China really ramped up their coal use. They installed new coal power plants. And that helped them keep up with industry, right? That helped them keep up with manufacturing demands. But interestingly enough, if you look in the more recent aspect of China, so sure, we see this massive increase, but actually in the last few years, the very end of that line, notice that it's actually also taking a negative dip. So even though China is like gangbusters on coal, China's also moving away from coal as, again, you know, the fundamentals is cost, right? So coal tends to be harder to move around, more costly in a couple of different areas. Beijing is famous for coal pollution, right? So that was one of the issues with having the Olympics in Beijing, is the athletes were worried they wouldn't be able to breathe because there's so much particulate matter, and they have famously poor air quality in China. And so when you're as a government, they start realizing, okay, let's lay off coal, and we have started to see that. And again, this diagram is only goes up to 2015, so it's dropped even more since then.